everyone, and a warm welcome to our latest client experience webinar session. We're delighted to have you all back and to recognise so many familiar names. If you want to tell us where you're from in the chat, that would be great. We love to know where our global audience is today. And also throughout this session, if there's comments that you would like to make or reflections or insight you would like to share, then please do put it in the chat, and I will certainly call out your comments to our two speakers today, who I'll introduce now. We have both Ash Rees and Scott Singer joining us today from Denton's Helix. And what is Denton's Helix, you might be asking yourselves? Well, these two gentlemen specialise in helping some of our clients really optimize their legal operations and matter on take model, and they do it in all sorts of different ways, but principally by understanding the goals clients have in terms of their efficiency and the way that they want to work, and then they bring in different tactics, whether that's precedents or playbooks or technology or changing your matter on take processes, all sorts of different tactics to improve efficiency. And at the heart of everything is really gathering data to inform better decision making. So they have a huge amount of insight to share with you today around this really important topic. So I will pass over now to them, but as I say, if anyone wants to interrupt at any point or put questions in the chat, we'd love to hear from you. Ash, over to you.
Thanks very much, Jude. Hi everyone. Well, great sort of global audience it looks like we've got from the chat there. So look, today we were going to be looking at legal operational change and its associated risk, and that's in an environment where we're being asked to work more efficiently and obviously be very cost conscious. So I'm going to speak about why legal functions look to make organizational change and what challenges they face in doing so. And then Scott's going to pick up around some of the key tools that are available and discuss a bit more around whether they actually help to reduce or increase risk off the back of them. So first of all, we're going to start with a quick poll. And I'll hand over to Jude for this.
Thanks, Ash. So yes, to get everybody engaged today, we thought we'd start by asking you 3 questions. You can just scroll down using the cursor on the right to make sure you can see and vote on all 3. The first question is very simply, do you have a risk register? Yes, no, or maybe you don't know if you do or you don't. The second question is, do your risk assessments have a value or an impact attached to them? Again, the same options are there. And the final question that we have for you today is, how would you describe your organization's risk appetite? Is it high, medium, or low? So we're very interested to hear your views today. Over half of you have already voted. I think it might take a little while for everybody to get through, so we'll just give you a few more seconds to keep voting. Okay, they're coming in. Okay, so let's give it 5 more seconds for people to vote. Get your clicking now. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, let's end the poll and share results with everybody.
Okay, so thank you everyone for doing that. So risk register, how many of you have one? Actually a nice large majority there, 69%, with 30% or so either not knowing or is a solid no. That's great to see. You know, risk registers are a fundamental tool, very easy to capture tool to really start looking at how you identify, prioritize risk, and then take it back into the business to either defend your organization or explain why you can't necessarily do what you're being asked to do. Do your risk assessments have high value and impact? Have value and impact associated to them? Again, 60% saying yes, which again is something which is slightly surprising, I guess. I've seen a number of organizations with their risk registers where actually prioritization is done, but actually then putting value and impact assessment is somewhat lacking. And then how would you describe your organization's risk appetite? No surprises here. Not many high risk appetites at this point in time, and a split between medium and low. I don't know, Scott, if you wanted to say anything about these.
Yeah, thanks, Alash. Yeah, look, a great way to start the session off, actually. And I'd pick out how interesting it is that 60% or so of people are actually putting a value against the risks they're identifying. That's quite a big change in practice. If you went back, say even 5 years ago, it was more a sort of RAG approach to it. And that's definitely what we're seeing more clients doing, recognizing that there are some risks that's very difficult to value, particularly around brand risk and reputational risk is quite a difficult one. And also really interesting to see how people describe their organization's risk appetite, with almost everybody over 90% in the medium or low category, which would be not surprising. I will share with people on this call that we run these sessions in 2 time zones, as people may know, and we did the APAC call so very early this morning. What was quite interesting was that the answers were slightly different in APAC, with a slightly lower number of people overall trying to put a value on their risks, and also a slightly higher number of people saying their organizations had a high risk appetite. So there's quite interesting differences there. Of course, if you do have a high risk appetite, and that's the environment some people operate in, then certainly having risk registers and having an opportunity to put values against them is a really important way of trying to manage that risk. Over to you, Ash.
Thanks, Scott. Okay, move to the next slide. Okay, so and the next one, please. So if part of what we do with Denton's Helix is really try and listen to our clients and really try and get under the bonnet to understand what's keeping them awake at night. And you'll see a number of things here. So these are kind of the external factors and sometimes internal factors that are pushing clients and businesses to look at how they change their operational legal organization. We hear it time and time again at the moment around efficiency. We need to become more efficient, and therefore I need to know what I should be doing with my technology and innovation. Every client is telling us that their in-house function is just really struggling with the amount of work that's being thrown their way, often kind of that low level, low complexity BAU type activity. And it just means that the senior lawyers you've got in your in-house teams are stretched just juggling all these mini low complexity legal requests, and can't really be focusing their time on where you'd probably want them to be focusing, which is the strategic priorities. And then obviously we've got the lower costs, and there's many organizations out there right now who are being asked to reduce their costs, and that obviously has a huge impact on delivery of legal services for a variety of reasons that I'll come to in a minute. And then we've got kind of the law firm side of things, and are you getting what you need from your law firms? Are they understanding your business, understanding your challenges, understanding your risk, and are they helping you with your operational change, or are they just doing what they do generically, which is give you the advice, obviously gold standard advice, 50-page reports, and lacking on the sort of one-page or one paragraphs, which may be more sufficient in certain circumstances. So each of these challenges are drivers for operational change. So the question we often kind of ask ourselves is, how do we operationally adapt in order to meet these challenges, and how do we then fix the issues? But we move on, it's never quite that easy, okay? There's always a balance to be struck because all of these challenges, or most of them, are interlinked with one another. So by adapting to solve one challenge, you often trigger many more, which then leads to additional risk that needs to be managed. So if we were to look at a kind of a mini case study here, if you're told that your business is needing to reduce costs internally by 25%, and your legal team therefore needs to play their part in that, and you've got an internal team of 10 lawyers, what do you do? Okay. And so what you can see here is just a few examples of how that kind of domino effect can happen. So you cut your costs, and if you cut your costs, you'll probably be initially cutting your internal workforce as a kind of a relatively standard response to that. But if you do that, you can obviously then do less work, and ironically, then you'll be increasing your legal spend because the work hasn't gone away. So you're actually paying more. Your total cost of legal may increase off the back of the headcount reduction you do internally, which then builds financial risk. You may also be sending the wrong work externally. So obviously, you might need specialist resource to do specialist work, or the rocket scientists do the rocket science work. But actually, maybe it's better to send some of the low complexity work externally and use your internal resource to do the strategic work and keep that knowledge internally. But if you don't do that and you send the sort of high value stuff externally, you've got, again, financial risk and the attrition risk, which leads on to the next one. If you've got a team which were struggling in the first place, and now there's fewer of them to do the work, they're going to get stretched, they're going to get frustrated, and then they see the quality work being given outside to external counsel. Often you will actually get some higher attrition in the team. Your senior lawyers will leave, and you've got that institutional knowledge gap. And my favorite one of all, obviously, is well, we need to cut costs, therefore let's not cut heads, let's just implement technology. I've never to date seen one standalone piece of technology really achieve the return on investment that was expected in the first place. I've never seen technology, or in inverted commas, innovation, makes sustainable change. So really, this needs to be taken into a more structured approach about where does technology, where can it apply in a larger scheme of interconnected sort of projects internally to change the organizational side of things. Finally, the worst case scenario here, you've done the sort of domino effect of all those above, and then the business starts coming to the legal department saying, hang on guys, the quality's dropping, you're not as responsive as you used to be, and guess what, the legal team's going to miss things, which then actually you've got the quality of service risk, all of which building together leads to that overarching brand risk. So that's one scenario, just starting with the cost cutting. But actually, as I said before, if you were to take any one of those and independently make the wrong choice about how you approach it, and you just try and tackle one challenge without being aware of everything else and all the interconnected challenges that come from that, then you could trip yourself up. Okay, but if we move on, there are options ahead to make this easier. It's not all doom and gloom at all. So here's some initial steps of how I would see the best way to approach this, which is start with the now. Okay, really start with the now. Understand your current state. Then look to what we would call the to be. So what's your business looking to do with its strategy over the next 3 to 5 years? And then once you've got your head around both of those two things, document it and analyze it. So you've actually then got a response back to your FD, COO board, or whoever it may be. Okay, so we'll go into a bit more detail about those now. So I just refer to this, the current state, as the now. Okay, so this is where you identify who is in your team. And believe me, I've spoken to some organizations where they actually aren't aware of who exactly is in their team and who isn't. So that's always a good place to start. Who is doing what work? Okay, so often, as I said, you'll find your senior lawyers doing the BAU, lower complexity, lower risky jobs internally, and you're sending too much of the sort of more strategic stuff externally. And so make a note of where the work is going externally, who you're giving it to, and you could even ask the question at this point as to why are we sending it to whoever we're sending to? Is it capacity? Is it specialist? Is it insurance cover? You know, many good reasons to send it externally, obviously, but you should be asking these questions and kind of getting the current state. And then I'd always recommend kind of speak to your team and get them around a table and really thrash through where are the current pain points right here, right now. You know, does procurement send everything to legal because they don't want to do it themselves and they could be doing more themselves? Is marketing ignoring legal completely and putting the business at risk? You know, your team's going to know what feels right to raise as a pain point and a challenge and capture that because it's very powerful later in this piece. And then identify where there are gaps, right? Where have you got gaps in knowledge? Where is there training need both for your team and for the business? And where are you feeling exposed because you haven't got the right coverage internally to keep the lights on and keep things moving in the right way? Then you've got to understand your external business strategy, okay? It's no good just knowing where you are now and to formulate a plan for change if your business strategy means actually you're going to need to adapt anyway. You're going to need to adapt because of M&A activity. So this is what we'd call the to be and what your team should look like going forward. So I don't know, Scott, if you wanted to say a few words around this part.
Yeah, thanks for that, Ash. So this is a really interesting area where we've seen over the last few years legal teams thinking quite carefully about this, and in particular recognizing that quite often a legal team is formed over time, and you end up with a model where all too often people are working incredibly hard, doing a high volume of stuff that is on their desks, which just needs to be churned through. And increasingly, we found that clients are wanting to have a closer alignment between the roles that their legal teams are playing and the value they add, and an organization's strategic objectives, or alternatively, an organization's risk, or possibly both of those. And so in a scenario which is actually fairly common, where you have a current state of a team which is a mixture but contains, you know, many team members who are just having to do a lot of BAU work in order to either service procurement or service sales and deals and so on. We've seen some of our clients step back from that a little bit and say, well, how can we actually get our team to add more value? You know, these are really important stakeholders in the business themselves. They will be in a position to be able to work alongside the business and partner and advise the business better than, you know, external lawyers could ever do, because they know the business better. And what can we do to actually free them up a little bit so that their contribution is adding the greatest value? And so against that background, having a look at the business's strategy and working out how does this align in terms of the role of legal, and also understanding the risks in that is a really important exercise. And we are increasingly seeing organizations be, you know, quite sort of critical about the work that's going on and looking to realign things so that they have a team which is much more strategic and much more business facing, adding greater value. Thanks, Ash.
Thanks, Scott. Okay. So you've done the as is, you've looked at the to be with the future strategy, and then it's time to put it all on a bit of paper. Okay. So, you know, it's great to see how many of you had risk registers, and I'll just give you a few of my top tips for risk registers. Keep them simple. They're a nightmare to keep updated if they're too detailed and too granular. So keep these themes at a relatively high level, and you can monitor there what's your current risk, and then do your scoring of likelihood versus impact. That will obviously then help you prioritize to see where you've got the higher impact issues that are very likely to happen, being the top priorities, and those that are either less impactful or less likely to happen as being lowered priorities. And for each of these then start, again, I would suggest with your team to look at what the mitigations can be. So if you work through them, often I see a good way of doing it is kind of the so what test, right? What does this mean? So what does this mean to our objectives? So what does this mean to our budgets? So what does this mean to the quality of our output or the quality of our work? And have a discussion, because an awful lot of the mitigations will come out of asking questions like that you can then put onto your mitigant list to make sure that these risks don't turn into issues, or ideally to get rid of them altogether. This isn't about avoiding operational change, and I don't want anyone in the school to think that you shouldn't be changing. Everyone should be changing and keeping as current as it can be, both with their functions and with the organizations that they sit in. But what this is trying to say is do it in a holistic way, understand where you currently are, understand what the future looks like, and then assess risk and the mitigations off the back of that. And once you've got that on a piece of paper, and if that piece of paper is simple and you can pull out the key themes from it, that's your defense against when you get tapped on the shoulder saying, right, cut another 10% off your workforce, or reduce your spend by X, or implement technology for technology's sake. Whatever the ask is, if it doesn't work because you've already identified what those risks are to the business, and you can show you've thought about the future, it changes the dialogue and it changes the conversation with the key stakeholders internally. Okay. So every organization and business is different, absolutely is. Everybody's going to have different appetites for risk and how to manage it. But the good news is there's also tools out there, stuff which we use day to day, and stuff which we may use day to day, but we didn't realize quite how useful it could be from a risk mitigation perspective. So now I'm going to hand over to Scott to talk about some of those tools.
Thanks so much, Ash. And so what we're going to do now is, having had an opportunity to have an overview with Ash, a bit of a lightning tour really around how do you track risk and measure it, and what sorts of approaches do you take to mitigate it. We're going to sort of rewind now to the scenario that Ash posed at the beginning of the call, which was, well, imagine you're in a position where you are being asked by the business to put in place some measures in order to save 25% of costs. I'm sure there's nobody on this call that is facing any scenario like that at the moment. The joke aside, we know that there's a huge amount of pressure on organisations to work much more efficiently. And so what we're now going to do is go on against that risk framework to look at what are some of the practical tools you can use to actually be operationally more efficient and therefore get cost reduction. And we're going to take a few of them and ask the question, well, what do they do in terms of your risk profile? Do they increase it? Do they decrease it? And are there mitigants for that? And as an entry point to that, we thought it would be good to introduce a second poll. So you can see here listed up on the poll some of the sorts of things in the toolkit that you might be using in order to be operationally more efficient. So whether it's new matter intake protocols or playbooks or precedents or data gathering, training, and so on. So we'll open the poll and let everybody have a chance to give us a feel as to what sorts of things are people doing who are logged into this call at the moment in order to try to be more efficient and reduce their costs.
Thanks, Scott. Nearly half of you have already voted, so you had fingers on the buzzers, if you like, while Scott was speaking. And I think when we reveal the results, it's also quite useful for you to be able to, if you like, benchmark what you're doing against the rest of the market as well, in terms of the trends and what people are working on at the moment. So yes, you've got lots of choices here between new matter on-take protocols. Are you looking at playbooks? Is data gathering the secret sauce that you need to be able to demonstrate trends and insight? Or are you trying to put more emphasis on the business helping themselves and promoting an increased use of self-service? And I guess in the same vein, are you therefore training and upskilling both the business and maybe your team? Maybe there are new risks that you've identified or new areas of business priority that you need your team to focus on. So maybe you are realigning resource at the moment, or perhaps introducing new technologies. Or if there's something else, a big other, we'd love to hear what it is. 12% of you have actually clicked other. So it would be great if you would put that into the chat right now, and then we've got an idea of what your other might be. So you've had a fair bit of time now to click on this. We'll give it another 5 seconds, and then we will close the poll and share results. So if you haven't yet voted, please do. Okay, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, and Jazz has put on trade compliance is a missing option on this. Thanks, Jazz.
Okay, super. Thanks so much, Judith. So, look, what an interesting set of results, actually. And we're seeing some more suggestions coming through, actually, which we can touch on in a moment. So playbooks, about 40% using playbooks, nearly half of you thinking about data and reporting, which I'm really pleased to see. About a third of you thinking about self-service, half of you talking about training, and just a bit under half looking at new technologies. Actually, interestingly, these results are quite similar to the ones that we got in the APAC region just a bit earlier, so there's good correlation there. And what we're going to do actually is take a look at 2 different sorts of tools within the toolkit just coming up. And one of them is actually around precedents and playbooks, and the other is around some of the legal tech, which could be useful here. I was very pleased to see, just before we move on, that there's quite a lot of people looking at data as a feature of this. And data is, it's one of the outputs you can get, of course, from using tech, but it is an incredibly powerful tool for helping you become more efficient. But also, if it's used well, it can help you reduce your risk. And so what we're going to look at now are a handful of tools in the toolbox. We're going to look at the use of precedents, playbooks, contracts and document automation, self-service, and AI. And I should say that as a little plug, just coming up actually in early March, the 8th of March, we're giving a further talk which really dives into much more detail around how you can achieve organizational and operational efficiency. We look at the whole toolkit. We picked out some specific ones here, and what we're going to look at now is, well, to what extent can you employ these? What are the pros and cons, and in particular, what impact do they have on your risk profile? Because something that I'll say at the outset is that overall, it is definitely our experience within Denton's, and in fact working in Denton's Helix, that working in different ways to be more efficient does not necessarily need to increase your risk. In fact, if you do it the right way, it can decrease your risk quite often. So if you move on then to the first of these and have a look at precedents. So I'd imagine that probably almost everybody on the call has got some degree of precedents in use within their organization. Actually, what I'd be interested to know, and again, if anybody wants to contribute by the chat, please do say, how many people have had the opportunity to do sort of a wholesale precedent project, reviewing your precedents and looking at them collectively? Because we've seen, especially over the last few years, a number of clients have decided to invest in looking at their suite of precedents and trying to get additional efficiencies out of reducing the number, streamlining them, conforming them. So, for example, they don't have sort of 15 different precedents dealing with liability or termination or warranties or indemnities or boilerplates in different ways. And with the huge advantages that actually come with just that extra bit of consistency. And I can think of one particular client we worked with who had over 100 precedents, and we worked with them to streamline it down to about a dozen. And those dozen precedents actually were able to meet about 90% of their needs and brought some great efficiencies. So precedents are, kind of a fairly sort of like sterile exercise to do, but actually they are one of the things in the toolkit which could bring one of the greatest gains. And in fact, I just say a comment here for one of the participants saying that they haven't done an exercise in 5 years or so. I'd say even having done it within the last 5 years is actually quite good going, because quite often, let's face it, you just build these things up over time, and the time and indeed the budget sometimes to step back and just look at it more holistically doesn't actually come that readily. But it is kind of one of the real low-hanging fruits, I think, around working more efficiently and having some time savings and cost savings. You know, one of the great things, obviously, is it lets you just get to a contract much quicker. We all know that. We also know the temptation, if you're a jobbing lawyer, to kind of use the last one you did. So having a really well thought out precedent is going to save you a lot of time. It's always going to be much quicker than that. It's also going to be much quicker and easier for new team members to onboard, because you've got something that's great, it's well thought out, it's ready to go. It reflects your organization's thoughts and policies actually in particular areas. So actually the sort of drag coefficient around expanding the team or bringing new people on board or working with new advisors is massively improved. I've spoken about the opportunity to streamline contracts and the synergies you get there and to achieve consistency. And I think this consistency point is really important actually, because one of the things that I picked up on the poll was that nearly half of you are interested in using data. So the thing about data actually is you can use all different sorts of data. In Denton's Helix, when we work with clients, we actually collect data on every single deal they do. So we'd measure maybe across 15 or 20 data points, and then we can report back to clients how they're doing, for example, in, I don't know, liability caps or indemnities or certain sorts of warranties or term and so on. And you can measure that over time to see changes. The point is, of course, that if you don't have consistency in your contracts, it's really difficult to capture that sort of data, because you're not really comparing apples with apples. And the importance of capturing that sort of data is that you can actually then start to get into your sort of overall organizational risk. So, for example, if you find yourself in a position where you're tracking, say, a topical subject, maybe indemnities for cyber breach, and you can track over a 12-month period that the coverage you get for that has decreased from, say, I don't know, 70% on capped indemnities down to, say, 30%, because the market has moved, and we have seen movements like that post GDPR. That's an incredibly powerful stat if you can track that across all of your contracts, because then as a legal team, you can flag that and you can recognize that as a business, you're carrying a lot more risk for cyber or data breach. And that can then channel a conversation with your CTO and to go to them and say, look, actually, we've seen this. As a business, we're carrying twice as much risk now for cyber breach. Practically, what mitigants can you put in place? Have you looked, for example, at your cyber insurance? Have you thought about the vendor DD policy or InfoSec and so on? So I think this is one of the examples actually where having precedents in itself gives you great efficiencies and time savings. But if you can actually align that with collection of data, it really allows you to manage your risk in an extremely interesting way. And so looking at the impacts on risk, we actually think that precedents projects are very helpful to measurably reducing risk. There's table stakes, the risk of contracts having gaps in or being in poor shape, of course, because precedents will work and will be well thought out. And therefore, they will have positions in them which you've really thought through carefully and reflect your organization's approach towards risk in various areas. And as I say, this consistency of position across the estate of contracts means it's much easier for you to spot what's going on across the whole business in terms of your risk. So that's precedents.
Scott, I'll chip in with some points from the chat. We didn't get lots of people posting that they've all done huge procurement projects. So maybe it's because, as Balji has put, that she has, or he has done that joyful exercise, because it's probably seen by many to being very painful as an exercise. Maybe that's why not so many people have shared in the chat they've done that. Hester has shared, and this might be something you want to pick up on later, around, well, they're facing pressure from procurement to expand their precedent bank. They've got just 3 currently, but they've resisted because they're finding that templates get used without lawyers thinking about the specific situation, etc. So maybe you will have some thoughts and tips to share perhaps at the end on how to sort of control the use of precedents, whether it's using technology to make sure they can't alter things too far against the original position, or other ideas around training or whatever. That might be something you might want to address at the end. So I thought I'd just chip in with that feedback. If anyone else wants to share any thoughts, please do put it in the chat.
Thanks a lot, Judith. And Bao, thanks for that point, because I think if I understand you correctly, you know, it's a really tough call to do a project like that in a huge kind of global organization. You've got all sorts of governance and different sorts of laws and different approaches and back. So I completely recognize that the theory may be slightly easier than the practice. Let's have a look at playbooks now, which go hand in hand with precedents. But what's quite interesting is, whilst most organizations have precedents, a minority are able to invest time in playbooks. And for those of you who haven't come across playbooks before, when we use that expression, what we mean really is a document that sets out your position on various key points in your contract. And you would, ideally in a playbook, you'd set out your sort of desired opening position, your best position. You'd have a fallback. You might have a further fallback even. And then you'd have kind of a red line beyond which you wouldn't go without escalation. And the playbook defines your risk appetite in a particular issue. So it's a really useful document. But it's also a document which really contains very valuable know-how about your approach to contracting in various areas. And playbooks, if you can invest time, do bring huge benefits, similar actually to precedents as well. You know, you can see that they would enable you to be much more time efficient in briefing team members actually around how you're going to approach a particular issue, whether it is, I don't know, you know, exclusions liability for loss of profit, loss of business, whether it's your approach to ownership of IP, whether it's your approach on termination triggers, for example, termination of convenience. A playbook's going to set out where you're going, that's what your ideal position is going to be. And that's super handy for making sure everybody's on the same page, and again, bringing on new members of the team. It also allows you to get greater consistency of approach, so that you know, people are dealing with the same issues and the same risks in the same way. So therefore, for risk, I think it's fairly uncontroversial to say that a positive impact is likely, because again, you're only going to be putting forward well thought out positions within your organization's risk appetite. And that consistency of position again makes it much easier for you to spot organizational risk as a whole. So that's precedents and playbooks. You would not have playbooks in our experience for every precedent. It wouldn't be worth the investment of time. But it is really worth something thinking about, maybe for a small number of your core contracts. And then what we want to spend a bit of time focusing on now is around tech. You heard Ash a little bit earlier say that, you know, he has rarely, if ever, come across a legal tech information project which returns on its investment. I think it's true in my experience as well. Tech is a tool. So just as when we get sort of the latest version of Google Docs or Word, it doesn't make us fantastic lawyers, obviously. You know, it's all to do with how we use it and what we do with them. And tech's no exception to that. But contract automation is something which has been around for quite a long time. There's a number of different packages out there. In fact, on our next session, the 8th of March, we'll talk about in a bit more detail. Denton's, we use Contract Express. It's very well known. But there's other options as well. And for those of you who haven't ever used contract automation, I really recommend having a bit of a demo. We'd be very happy to show you what's possible if you want to get in touch offline, because it is very, very powerful these days compared to sort of the early days of contract automation, where you could you know, rely on it to basically change the name of the parties and the address of service of notice. We can do much more these days with conditional decision trees. And so within Denton's, working with our clients, and in particular, actually as part of Denton's Helix service, we would automate a whole bunch of different sorts of documents. We were, I'll just tell you anecdotally, this just before Christmas, we were presenting at the Lawyer GC Summit and held a series of roundtable sessions with GCs, asking them to what extent are you using document automation and what are you automating? And a minority of organizations were automating documents, a bit, well, I say minority, about 40% or so. But of those, almost exclusively, there's only one document that is being automated. This would have probably been a good thing to have a poll on to see whether people could agree with that, but it was NDAs actually, which is a very common automated document. But actually, these days you can do way more than that. I mean, we're working with clients on short and long form services agreements, on master framework agreements, on various real estate documents, even employment documents. We're automating, so you can do an awful lot. And you could, for example, have some logic which probes whether there's any staff movements as a result of the transaction, and then there could be a 2P clause put in or not. Or you could be asking questions as part of the pro forma at the front of the automation form around, is any IP being created? In which case you'd be having IP clauses which are consistent with your organization's approach to creation of IP. Maybe you want to own it, maybe you want some sort of license and exclusivity and so on. So it is worth revisiting document automation. And, you know, for sure, it does bring with it some good benefits. It does give you a time saving. Looking honestly, it's not kind of the killer app. It saves a bit of time. It's not going to do all the work for you. I think a really well automated document, particularly if it's a slightly longer document, so the automation actually is working harder for you, could save 15% of the time, maybe 20% of the time. And remember that it's actually starting from a brilliant precedent anyway. Of course, you can't do it without a great precedent. And so just by having the precedent itself, as we were saying in the earlier slide, gives you kind of a big win in time saving as well. But actually, part of the point of automating contracts isn't just for lawyers, it's also the ability to be able to channel some sorts of documents into self-service by the business so that lawyers themselves don't need to get involved. We'll look at that actually on the next slide. And it does, just kind of as one of the pain points that we have as lawyers, if you're drafting, it does actually help with the stuff like cross-referencing and definitions, just to make sure that they're all in good shape. And there's a great question here from Bao, which if we've got some time at the end, we'll leave some we can talk to Judith. So what is the risk actually of using contract automation? And we are putting it, but again, I'd really welcome people's thoughts who are dialed in. We put it as risk neutral. And because in many ways it should reduce risk in the same way as precedents do as well, by ensuring that only approved documents are used and also the documents are in good shape and actually work and so on. However, the risk with using automated documents is that they could create a risk by encouraging use of inappropriate contracts, particularly where a deal is more complex or more bespoke. Then an automated document will still possibly be suitable, but it could give people sort of too much of a comfort blanket, and they might underestimate the amount of work they need to do in customizing and really thinking it through. One of the biggest issues that we always have, as you know, as lawyers, is kind of the stuff that you don't spot. So if you're using automated documents, it's very important they're supported by clear guidance about what scenarios they cover. And then if we move on to the next, which really goes hand in hand with contract automation, this is around self-service. And self-service is going to give you potentially possibly the biggest win in terms of increased efficiency and cost reduction, because the way self-service works, as I'm sure most people in the call know, is it's the ability to be able to have users within the business, so non-legal members of the business, serving themselves and being able to do contracts themselves. And obviously, if you can do that well and do that safely, that's a huge win, because going back to some of the earlier comments that Ash was making around a business's strategy and around alignment between a business's strategy and the way in which the team works, what you're going to be doing if you're having that closer alignment and you're wanting your lawyers to do the stuff where they can really add value is not do the stuff they don't need to do. And so self-service is a really good way of dealing with that. Now at the lawyers GC summit that we were at late last year, we also did a straw poll around use of self-serve documents too. And there we found that fewer organizations were doing self-service than contract automation. It was a minority, perhaps around 15-20% or so. So not really that many. And interestingly, outside organizations that had sort of a very large sales process, where very commonly you'd have the sales team actually having access to customer-facing documents they would self-serve. Outside that, if you're looking sort of more at procurement type stuff, we found that there was only one document people were really letting the business loose on, and that was again NDAs. So look, a good opportunity to challenge yourselves actually around self-service, because we work with clients who have had the opportunity to really think this through and to consider within their risk appetite, what would it be possible to actually get members of the business doing directly if they're supported with great precedents, with good playbooks, with contract automation. You can actually self-serve a huge number of additional documents. And we've got clients who, in fact, clients we work with through the Dentons Helix service that are self-serving really quite complicated goods and services agreements, for example, among others. You can push the boundaries of that depending on the user base you have. If you're fortunate to have experienced procurement teams, then they can do an awful lot for themselves. And of course, one of the key things around self-service is making sure that you have good channels, so that people are very clear about what are the limits, what are the red lines, and so there's a line back into legal if people start getting stuck or it gets trickier. So that's a great way of mitigating the risk. So overall, as I say, there's huge benefits to self-service. I mean, we've got one client who looked at this and took a really considered view on this, because they did actually have a chunky savings target to meet, and one of the ways in which they looked at meeting it was by working out, well, they've got great people in the business who aren't lawyers. To what extent can they take on some of the legal work themselves through self-service? And they actually were able to achieve about a 15–20% saving, in fact, of legal time through really investing in self-service and the appropriate infrastructure. However, self-service, I think, is probably one of the ones where we'd say could potentially lead to increased risk. It doesn't have to. It depends actually all around the way in which you set it up. So set it up with, as I say, good supporting processes, good playbooks, good documents themselves, but also set it up so that it's very clear and very easy, in fact, for non-legal people to then get aligned back into legal, so that if they are going off playbook, or they're getting into areas that they're not comfortable with or aren't covered, that they get proper legal support. And the risk, therefore, of self-service, as you can see from the slides, is the risk of points not sort of being inappropriately conceded and not appropriately dealt with. And also the other risk, again, I'll touch on this just briefly here. We mentioned it just a little bit earlier, didn't we, around automation, is the risk of issues not being spotted. And that is a big issue. I mean, it's an issue which we all grapple with as lawyers. For those who are kind of saddened with the negligence cases of being involved in management, you kind of have an eye for this sort of stuff. The way in which most negligence happens in professional services isn't through what you do, it's through omission, it's through what you don't do, what you don't think about. And so again, within a self-service or sort of automated regime, it might give people a comfort blanket and not encourage them to think fully actually around all of the things they need to cover off. And indeed, if you've got non-lawyers that are using self-service, they may well be in a position where they couldn't possibly spot what some of the other issues are. So a health warning for that. And then just finally, very briefly, because I want to leave just a little bit of time for questions and still with some of the points that have been raised, if we just move on to the final point, and that's around the use of AI. And AI is something which I'm only going to speak about very briefly because it is the subject of an entire session itself. We will cover this in some more detail actually on the 8th of March session. But I'm just going to make a few comments around it. So you can't pick up papers these days but for reading about AI and warnings that computers will sort of kind of take us all over and you'll be in a Terminator type scenario. I think the good news that I can offer for us lawyers, I think it is good news, is that we're not going to be replaced by robots or by AIs quite yet, actually. So the applications that are out there, and there's loads of them, aren't really yet at a very useful stage. That's the honest truth about it. In Denton's, we have got a whole team actually that focuses on legal tech and AI. We've got some true experts there, and they're out in the market. And so the approach that we would always take is you identify the the use case and the need, and then we will use a specific AI for that, because AIs are developing in quite narrow verticals these days. And so the big well-known ones like Luminance and so on are very good at some things, but they'd actually be pretty awful actually at other things as well. So there's a bit of a health warning with AIs. And for those of you who kind of haven't looked at AIs as to what do they actually do, well, what they do is they use sort of computer-led machine processes in order to take some of the kind of the human work out of doing a transaction normally, or potentially a piece of litigation by way of discovery, or a piece of due diligence or evaluation actually around a suite of documents. And I think used in that way, AI can be very good. And I think that I would suggest for any of you who haven't used AI yet would be a great way to go into it, think about it as something which can give you sort of a bit of a head start and save some of your time, but it won't do the job for you. Although I should say now contradicting myself, we use a lot of it within Denton's. We use it wherever we can actually, and we've got good conversations with clients around their risk appetite and around, how to use it safely. And we run quite a lot of pilots. We've got a fantastic lead actually in this area called Joe Cohen. And we run all sorts of tests actually. And one of the tests that we ran about 6 months back was using an AI to analyze various clauses within leases. And interestingly, the AI came back about 3 percentage points more accurate than human beings, which is quite interesting. So they can be really good in some cases, but they're not a substitute actually for humans. The upside, though, is they can significantly speed up the production of a first cut of work, which can save time and cost. And as I said, there are some kind of, narrow verticals where, in fact, that they can be even more accurate than humans are. Because let's face it, we're not perfect. Actually, and most problems, being a TMT lawyer myself, those of you that are kind of involved in tech, they know that actually most issues in tech and tech projects actually tend to come from human error rather than the tech itself. But as I said, they're not very developed, and so inherently they're riskier than using humans if used in the wrong way. So go into them with your eyes open. They can be a good tool. They can give you some quite reasonable cost reduction. We've got some clients actually where there'd be a large project, but they're wanting to do an assessment of provisions and various clauses across a suite of sort of similar agreements. We have really interesting conversations these days, and we would give a quote for doing it purely the traditional way using human beings, and then a quote doing it by AI with maybe a sort of just a little bit of human intervention, and then maybe a middle quote of using AI with more human time in there. And for sure the AI can give you significant cost reduction, but also as part of that, if you want to go down that route, you're probably accepting a lower level of accuracy potentially. But lots of clients, depending on what they're doing, will be really happy to trade that off. So that was a bit of a lightning tour around some of the things that we're seeing clients do and that we're working with them on to help be more efficient, to save cost, and against the background that Ash so helpfully painted for us, trying to understand, well, what impact does that have on your risk? And as you can see, in fact, doing stuff which is more efficient, cost saving does not necessarily increase your risk. In fact, we'd say it can reduce your risk if you do it the right way. So we've got a bit of time left for questions. We'll be really happy to take any specific ones, or Judith, if there's any particular points that you've pulled out from the chat, we can speak to those as well.
Thanks so much, Scott, and also to Ash for taking us through such an interesting topic, really, and all the different options that are available to everyone. If anyone does want to come off mute or pose a question in the chat, now is your time. I guess, while people are thinking about doing that, the takeaway that I had from the chat is really that nervousness around, how much you give to other business stakeholders and how you really manage that risk. And there's people that are doing it, but how do you get yourselves comfortable with doing it? Is it just for the very high-end sophisticated procurement users you'd go for, or have you got any views or tips around this?
Yeah, look, these are very real problems actually. It's like a hugely live issue. It's the biggest barrier actually to self-service, which, as I suggested, probably is kind of the biggest winner in terms of being able to kind of honestly reduce legal time and therefore cost. And look, there's it sort of depends, doesn't it, who you're working with. If you've got sort of expert procurement professionals, then that can be great. But actually, so much of all these things that our clients are doing every day brilliantly, much more brilliantly than we can do externally, than we do try, is building up deep relationships and trust relationships with the people in the business they're working with. So you've got to kind of trust each other. And yes, if you're going to make some really cool tools available, and look, one of the other great things I didn't talk about around automation and self-service is it's very empowering actually to give people some cool stuff that they can do their job with more autonomously, more quickly is a brilliant thing to do. But you do need to have some trust, okay? So investing some time in those relationships, so that people know clearly kind of what are the boundaries, and they feel they can get a line into legal actually, can really improve that. But again, so go on, Ash.
Sorry, Scott. I was just going to add to that as well. Look, one of the other things you can do, look at the work that's in the team currently that you're thinking, oh my goodness, why are we touching this every day, right? Then go to the raisers of those types of requests, a small group. Make sure that the request type is low risk to begin with, and once you've automated the document, you can set it up. So actually, then it needs to siphon through to legal first to do a check prior to going back to the end user. And that you wouldn't use, obviously, negates the entire point of doing it if you were going to do that forever, but you can do that in the first instance, maybe for a week, 2 weeks, 1 month, to just build that trust so you can make sure any questions that they might have, they can ask. And once you get to that point, that they're, you know, it's a good way of training, right? It's hands-on training, make sure they've got all the support they need. And then at that point, let them run wild with it and you should be in a better place.
Thanks both. Are there any other questions from anyone? If there aren't, then it only leaves me to say, if you did want the slides from today, then please email cxprogram@dentons.com. The email address is on the bottom of the slide there. And obviously, we've got more great content coming up for you in the coming weeks. You've heard from Scott and Ash that they'll be back to talk about how to drive efficiency internally and externally. And we've got more sessions coming up next week as well on growing your network for personal and business success. So hopefully we will see you all again then. Otherwise, please enjoy the rest of your days, and thank you very much for joining us all today. Thank you.